Hi, Jodell. Nice to see you again.
Nice to see you, Israel. It's fantastic to be with you again.
Awesome. Well, I've been following some of your work, and you post pretty consistently, having your Torah talks, which is wonderful. We're now in the holiday season, as it happens at this time of year in the biblical holidays. But I suppose I wanted to talk to you about the apparent contradiction or maybe conflict of thinking that exists between religious people and non-religious people. And let's assume we're talking about good people, right? People that understand, don't kill, don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal. People that apparently claim that they can intuit those things and that that's obviously the best way to live. Versus people that believe in a strict doctrine that comes from a God that says you must do this because I said so, beyond just because you believe it's right. Why do you think that it's necessary to have that, and why do you think the Torah is reliable to be that revelation?
This is such an important question. And this really does get to my heart because and it's so weird because we think of Judaism and Christianity as being so far removed from each other. And I have to say this so ironic. I just got off the phone with a friend of mine and we were having a very similar discussion. Whether you look at Judaism, where it teaches that righteousness is really obtained by doing charity, by doing good works, Christianity kind of has the same ideology where as long as I'm a good person, now we're not going to define what a good person is. We're just going to leave this nebulous. But as long as I'm treating my neighbor as myself, which means if I want to be treated that way, you must want to be treated like that too, whether that's correct or not. And as long as I'm doing that, I'm a good person and I'm righteous, and nothing more is required of me. The problem is that we get into so many conflicts with that. We get into mutually exclusive ideas that are totally incompatible with each other. And there ultimately is no criteria for what for us to judge our behavior. Is my behavior good? Is it bad? What separates us from everybody else that is a good upstanding citizen? Or they're not going out and killing everybody. Is that are we looking at the bottom of the barrel where this low standard of don't kill, don't just commit adultery, as long as you do that, then you're good, and there's nothing else. I find that from the written Torah perspective, it's a national constitution that has such amazing rules and regulations and instructions for everyday living. I mean, it's so much more than just do's and don'ts that I know I was taught that it was, and that it was oppressive. Now I'm finding it's a law of liberty, and a philosophy. It's so meaningful, it's so rich and purposeful that when you do it, it provides amazing joy because you're going to avoid all the other pitfalls. So for me, that's one of the reasons why I love it. And I do find that nations could be healed if we simply follow the written instructions.
Well, that would be beneficial. I think we both agree on that. And I was having a conversation with a friend of mine yesterday, and he was really contending with this fact that why do we need to rely on a single revelation, something like the Torah, which by its own definition is a final revelation in the do not add or subtract. Not to say that there's nothing that you can gain outside of the Torah, but ultimately the Torah is it as it presents itself in the fashion of do not add or subtract. This is the direct word of God, and this is what you have to do. And I just think that if people understood the significance of the things that the Torah was talking about, they wouldn't be so quick to dismiss it. Because to them, they hear things like the laws of kosher, for example, you can't eat these animals, or the idea of animal sacrifice, which seems primitive and reductive to the modern mind. And in their eyes, they say, well, this just looks like another stupid religion, and of which there are many, and I think that's undeniable. there's a lot of superstition and problems that come with the past religions and even present religions. So, how do you differentiate when you look at the Torah? Why do you see it to be so meaningful and correct?
Several reasons. Number one, I have studied ancient law codes. I'm still studying them. I don't know that I'll ever come to a point where, my study of ancient Near Eastern documents, Egyptian documents, or other law codes, I just love it. And I love the comparison and I learn so much from it. So, what I see is when we look, say, for instance, at the Hammurabi Code, there's a lot of cogency there between the Torah and some of the things that the Hammurabi Code has. But at the same time, there's a lot of differences. And those differences really set Israel's religion apart, because what you see happening is Jehovah is taking all of the prevalent laws that were popular during the day, that were common. I mean, today we talk about common law. And, there were common laws that both Egypt, Assyria, and all these nations followed. Not that they were universal, but they were pretty similar. And God totally revamps them. He reforms them so that the way that, and from my perspective, at one point in time, when you had Noah, the whole world would have had truth at one point in time. But then as you go through history, and by the time you get to Abraham, nations had departed from that. They no longer walked in truth. They added, they subtracted, they did all these things. So when you look at the Torah, it totally reforms those other systems. Like, for instance, and even when you look at very ancient Chinese literature, you find that one of the judgments they had is if you committed an act that the king didn't like. I mean, it could be an act of treason, but that's how we normally think of it. But it could even be something more benign. You cross the king in some way. It wasn't just you that was executed. It was your whole entire house. And I believe in ancient China, the way that you called it was like the rule of seventh, where seven of your ancestors, your father's household, were put to death. We see Saul doing this with the high priest of Nob, when he thinks they're crossing him. They've been betrayed, and he takes and he destroys him and his father's house. And then you see all these prophecies where the prophets say, okay, you've sinned. It's not just going to be you that's going to be affected. It's also going to be you and your father's house. So this was a common way that judgment was rendered in ancient times. But the Bible reforms this by when Jehovah says the son shall not be put to death for his father, or the father be put to death for his son, each man for his own sins. That's a revolutionary concept. That didn't exist, to my knowledge, anywhere in the ancient Near Eastern world. So this was a huge reform.
Yeah, and even to the extent that common law has always existed, it hasn't always been followed, right? And so there were people that knew about Yehovah before the Torah was given. I mean, Adam and Eve, Seth, Noah, Enoch, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. So obviously there was an awareness of God and his law even prior to the Torah being given. The way I look at the Torah is it's confirmation, where God is saying, if I'm going to come down and talk to you people for the one time in documented human history where God speaks to an entire nation, in offering them the clear prescription for a healthy society, he's going to reiterate these things because even though they're obvious, they're not actually practiced. And to this day, where we are so enlightened, according to people's personal assessment of their character, with all of our enlightenment, these things are still rampant. And so, obviously, we need to hear it again and again.
We really do. And I find that modernly we have so many go arounds. We justify so many things. What I'm hearing among rabbis is, well, that was ancient. That was for ancient Israel. It's out of date. It's out of its time. What I hear among Christianity is it was too hard. It was too difficult, and it's out of date. So the conclusion so both Rabbinic Judaism and Christianity arrive at the same conclusion, just by different paths. And I'm like, well, let's wait a minute. Before we throw it out, let's see if there's anything redeeming in it. And that's really where my journey started. well, I won't say how many years ago. Let's just say it was a few. Um, and the very first question that I had is, if God gave ancient Israel a law code, a legal document that was not good for them, that didn't benefit them, then God had sinned. Then God had not, he had misrepresented himself, misrepresented what he was doing at Mount Sinai, and then the promises that he gave were bunk. So did God lie? If God lied, then he's not being honest. And again, God would have sinned. So that's kind of where my journey started. And the more I dove into the law, the more I examined it, the more I'm like going, oh my goodness, this makes sense. Like, for instance, I see the instructions that deal with the foreigner coming into the congregation, where it says that an Egyptian can come in after 3 generations, can come into the Kahal, whereas a person from, say, a hostile government like Moab or Ammon, they couldn't come. And I'm speaking specifically of the males, because females didn't really have, and people have a hard time understanding this with our modern equal rights, but women didn't carry any citizenship by themselves. But so when you look at those males from hostile nations, they couldn't come into the Kahal for 10 generations. I find so much wisdom in that. And I look at here in the United States, the issues that we are plagued with as a nation, with foreign entities coming in. They gain citizenship, and what do they do right away? They try to subvert the government into ways that don't align with our values. And we're powerless against it because there's no protocols that prohibit them from joining our government, from influencing our legal and our administrative statutes. So I think that's a very, very wise protection that God established in his law.
Yeah, and the ultimate protection against all corruption is the law itself. Because even if people come from non-hostile nations or from nations that are allowed to enter the congregation, or they are native Israelites themselves who go against God, there's one law for the native and the sojourner. There is no actual distinction. Everyone's held to the same law. So that's the protection. Is how do you guard against corruption? Is everyone's held equally under the law. And, that's understood intuitively. I think the problem is whose law? That's the real question. And when we come into the conversation of the Torah, we're looking at God's law. And that's something that's very hard for people to wrap their head around, because to them, law is man-made. Law is something that we come upon by consensus, and we decide what is right and wrong and how we want to govern our societies. I don't think people understand how important it is to have God's word in all of this in order to provide a sense of objectivity. Because if we don't have that, we are up we are up to our own devices, and that's clearly not sufficient.
No, absolutely. And it's so odd because I do find that whether I'm talking with pastors or I'm talking with rabbis, so many of their premises and their disagreement with the written Torah really comes down to the fact that they believe that it was man-made, that is not of divine origin. But when you look at the things that it reformed, it is absolutely genius, the different ideas that it reformed during the day. There's even, like, when a man and a woman fight, or rather 2 men are fighting and a woman comes along, there where it says, if any harm come to them, that's a stronger wording, because that exact same instruction is found in the Hammurabi Code, but it's stronger in the Torah, indicating that if any harm comes to either mother or child, that there is some sort of judgment. So that you're supposed to be very careful with women. You're supposed to protect life. You're supposed to guard it, because that's your future.
Right.
If you
You're
don't
supposed
have
to have civil societies where men are not fighting in the streets.
Yeah. Imagine that. You can actually solve your disagreements in other ways by, picking up your fist. You can actually have a civil discussion, and if that breaks down, then it says, you take it to the court. Whether it's the elder or the judges or the Levites, you had several different options for remedies of conflict.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, and you need that. Now, the whole point is the reason why it never worked out for Israel is because they didn't follow the law. There couldn't be any clearer explanation of that than the Old Testament itself, which is of Jewish origin, yet they condemn themselves to the worst possible fate by, first of all, a prophecy in Deuteronomy foretelling that this is what they would do. And then as you continue on into the rest of the Old Testament, it's actually describing to you what happened. This is what happened. Israel did not follow the law. They did not follow God, resulting in their exile and their destruction. So, I mean, this is all spelled out very clearly. So, for this statement, people like to say, oh, God's law never worked out. It was never implemented. The promises were never fulfilled. It's like, well, the people never never did their side of the bargain. It was a two-way street.
Exactly, and that's where people overlook the fact that the law itself and the blessings tied to the law are self-fulfilling. So like especially say Deuteronomy 28, the caustic laws, where you have the if then, where if you fulfill the requirement or the stipulation, then you will have the blessing. So when you do it, it produces its own reward. And we know from American history, and when we look at world history, and especially English law, that when you have just laws and you have a very civil society, you are going to have a lot of peace. You're going to have a lot of harmony. At the same time, where you have societies where the laws are oppressive, where they contradict, where they limit, grossly limit whether it's human speech or interaction, or promote a certain class over another class, that always leads to some sort of conflict and instability in the society. So all of these factors are very, very important. And the other thing that I think is really important to realize is that a lot of the Torah isn't necessarily geared towards the individual. It's really geared towards the government. So, for instance, when you look at Exodus 21 through 24, where you have all of the judgments, those are applied to court cases. Unless you're a judge or a jury, you're not going to use that in everyday life. Now, you can extrapolate that, and your interactions with your friends and families, you can follow those in your dealings and making sure that you're right and just. But as far as actually following them, you're going to have a court of law. But that is, again, what establishes peace in society. It keeps the victim and the victim's family from coming away with resentment that they went to court, they had their case tried, and they had no satisfaction. So there's hard feelings, and eventually those hard feelings come into some sort of physical or political conflict.
Yeah, I agree. The Torah is extremely law-based, despite the fact that it resonates on so many levels, metaphorically, uh, and the narrative too. I mean, that's something that even people who are anti the Torah's law can't help but resonate with the stories and with the heroic arc of all of these people and the characters in the Bible that have shaped history, culture, society, and law for thousands of years. And to me, it's like if you find so much value and so much divine inspiration from these words, shouldn't you start to take seriously even the parts that maybe are a little more difficult for you to accept? As in the fact that this book is the same book that teaches you everything you know. Just maybe, the one or two parts that are difficult for you to grasp or to accept, maybe you should consider accepting that on faith because this book seems to be real. And the people talked about are, they speak so deeply to our soul that it would be, I mean, it would be sacrilegious, which is a funny word to use for someone who doesn't care about religious, uh, sensitivities, to actually reject the divinity of this revelation. It doesn't seem wise, actually.
Yeah, I agree. And and that's kind of where I had gone back and forth over the years when I first began this journey some years ago. And I had begun to see enough truth, enough of the things. It's like, okay, God says to do this, and I would go and I'd check it out. Is there any validity to it? Because that is one of the definitions of truth, is that if something is true, if it's real, it's going to be valid. Often it's observable. You can verify it by some external means. So, for instance, when it came to the biblical kashrut and those instructions, and Exodus 15:26 really hit hard with me. It says, if you are faithful and just to obey all these statutes and judgments that I put before you this day, I will put none of the diseases upon you that I put upon the Egyptians. Well, I ask questions. I mean, I ask questions so much that in high school, I had an award winning algebra teacher in tears because I kept asking why. I kept pushing that envelope. Okay, yeah, but why? Because I want to know the whys. I want to understand it because it just
You're not going to get
resonates.
any answers in algebra, that's for sure.
No, nothing that was satisfactory. There's still an X floating around out there somewhere. But so for me, I began when God, if I date the Exodus, say, around 1500, then my question was, if He won't put Egypt's diseases upon us, then what diseases did Egypt struggle with? So I started buying all of these technical studies, all of these papers on Egyptian mummies that would go in. And in the early days, this is kind of giving away how long ago this was. In the early days, your MRI and CT scans could not evaluate soft tissue material. So we could only get the fact that they had a heart disease, they had osteomyelitis, osteoporosis, they had all the cardiovascular diseases that we had today. And then more recently, probably about the last 8 years, we've been able to, or they've been able to analyze soft tissue, where discovered they also have cancers. So now, okay, so ancient Egypt has all the cancers that we have today. What you could find in the very early years, in the early 1900s, were studies done on Torah observant Jews, where they actually followed the biblical diet. They abstained from pork. They didn't eat the blood. They made sure it was poured out. They followed the biblical protocols. And there was a Mount Sinai hospital, I believe in New York or Boston, that kept very accurate records. And back then you could keep records according to race and ethnicity. And it was discovered that Jews had far less rates of cancer, like almost non-existent cancers, almost non-existent heart disease, while everybody around them was experiencing this. So for me, I walked away with some of those studies saying, okay, there's a direct correlation between good health and following these statutes where Yahweh says he'll put none of these diseases upon us. And that really, really impacted me. And since then, I've done a lot of other studies, and those other studies have produced this exact same results.
Mm. Yeah, well, I mean, the promises of health are actually absolute. And I love that the source you gave in Exodus, because over there, God explicitly calls himself the doctor, the healer, saying, I'm the guy who's going to heal you, not the human doctor. And, that's a very different approach that people have to nowadays, where everything is geared towards the medical system. The doctors are considered to be the saviors. They're basically the new priests. Went
Mhm.
from the priest and the rabbi to the doctor, to basically he's the ultimate one who decides life and death and receives the greatest respect and worship. And I think all of this is extremely misplaced when you look at the fact that God is the one who creates law, God is the one who gives life, and God is the one who heals. And so what is the promise? Yes, following the dietary laws is a good idea for those things, but obviously there are Jews who keep the dietary laws and still suffer from sickness. So, the cause for sickness in the Torah, which again is something that people have a hard time dealing with, because in our minds, sickness and health is arbitrary and it's completely scientific and random, mostly, especially if you follow protocol of health. But the Torah says it has to do with obedience and disobedience of the commandments. Same thing with infertility and all of these things, right? Like God says, And this is where the faith comes in. But ultimately, I don't know who I should believe in. Why would I believe in the medical system? They've proven themselves to be so full of malpractice and corruption, and ultimately they're just people like me telling me that they have the cures to unknown diseases. It's absurd. But when
Well,
you
and
God is saying, you obey me, I will heal you.
absolutely. And to your point, you know, so many of what you're talking about, you don't have a vested interest in it. It's like, you could say this or that, and maybe you're looking out for the best interest of the people, but we know with the medical system, it's all about,
Yeah.
they make a pretty good living off of us.
I mean, yeah, they profit off of people's sickness. And that goes into the drug companies, the insurance companies, which all ties back to the government. And it really has to do with the fact that they're putting people on medications from the time that they're young children. A newborn baby comes out of the womb as immediately inoculated with multiple substances, claiming that that's going to be the salvation for their life. Like, do you really, if someone who has belief in God has to believe that God created this world to work, and then God created the human body to function, to heal, to build up immunity, to build up strength. And everything about modern living deteriorates the spirit and the body, even though we are more comfortable than we've been. But it's like, sacrificing comfort for actual health and vitality is probably a worthy sacrifice.
Right. Well, and just to kind of go down this rabbit trail, that I will say, about the last 4 or 5 years, I've learned a lot more about homeopathy, which basically takes, plant-based derivatives of it will isolate certain ingredients in those plants and herbs and magnify them and use those as medications. And those have like almost no side effects, but yet they still deliver an impactful benefit if you're facing something. Like arnica is great if you're in pain, it will relieve pain. Then you have aconite, that is great for boosting the immunity, helping you uh, fight diseases or fight illness. It can also help with anxiety. So there's a lot of alternate things that everything we need, God has put in the herbs and the plants around us. And yeah, we can extract that. We can enhance it so that we get the benefit of it. But he's put it there for us. The problem is you can't monetize that, because according to law, if it occurs in nature, then you can't patent it, because I mean, it's a
Mhm.
naturally occurring substance. So you
Have
can
to
only,
alter it. You have to
yeah,
alter it.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, I mean, look, it obviously makes sense that there are healing properties on the earth itself. And I mean, even something like a cup of tea can go a long way when you're not feeling well. And it's like, okay, so all of these methods, which have been around for thousands of years, which we've actually lost touch with due to the monetization and the commercialization of medicine, is completely gone out the window. But again, it comes back to the Torah, where it's like, well, what do you do when you've been completely, uh, I mean, for lack of a better word, enslaved? It goes back to Exodus, the Israelites calling out to God from the depths of slavery, right? Like, when there's nothing you can do, when you're completely controlled by the governing institution, and there's really nothing you can do as an individual, the best you can do is call out to God, and that seems to work out pretty well.
I completely agree. And this for me is where it matters who you call out to, because there are so many promises that are tied directly to using the divine name. And I know that can be a very controversial issue for a lot of people.
Yeah, because
Uh,
people can't wrap their head around the idea that God has a name, even though God
right.
explicitly says in the Torah. I mean, again, it's not to say that we understand God through this name or that's the only name, but let's just work with what God provide. Let God define himself, right? Let him give his own name, his own law. God says, I am Jehovah, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This is my remembrance for all time. That's
Exactly.
a statement from him.
Exactly. Well, and what Moses's question was, okay, who shall I say to the Israelites? Who shall I say is sending me? or is going to deliver them. And in that context, Egypt had hundreds of deities. They had a god for everything. They had a god for childbirth. They had a god for death. They had, a god for the fields, a god for the Nile, a god for everything. So which god is this? And when God responds and he says, "This is the name that I want to be called by," he says, "My memorial to all generations for all time." If I don't take that seriously, then I'm playing religion. I'm playing a game. I'm saying that God's words don't mean anything and I don't care. And I think that's a very prideful statement and a very prideful attitude to take rather than saying, "Oh, God said it and he actually meant it." I think that's a much wiser approach to those texts. And then you look through, whether it's through Deuteronomy or you look through the prophets and the Psalms and Proverbs, there are so many prophecies that talk about when you use that divine name, when you call on that divine name, and how Jehovah will hear you. He will respond to you. Whether you use Jehovah, Yahweh, I mean, you are called, I mean, there's no other deity today that you're calling out to if you use one of those names. You are specifically calling out to Israel's God and Israel's God alone. And he's promised, I mean, so many promises that if we call out to him, he will hear us and he will respond. That's the promise.
Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty significant thing. And people say, oh, well, it's just a name. A name doesn't really matter. But why would people say that names don't matter? Names obviously matter. Your name matters. My name matters. Don't you think God's name matters? Like this attempt to diminish all of these things, like, again, animal sacrifice or written like books. Like, why are books not important all of a sudden? Books are important. The Torah is the account that we have for thousands and thousands of years. The fact that it's a book, the fact that it's a name, people are like, oh, it's a little too tangible, it's a little too reductive for God, and it's like, well, God is attempting to communicate with us by means that we can understand, and these things like names, like books, like stories, like words, these are things that are part and parcel of existence itself. They're not small things. They're not insignificant. They do matter, and we think that just because it's recognizable to us as humans, so now all of a sudden it's not important. I mean, aren't we created in the image of God? That means that the things that we interact with are directly in the image of the things that God interacts with, be it emotion, be it the experience of life. God Himself is the creator of that. So it makes sense that these things would have meaning.
I agree. And, the sacrifices I know are a hugely contentious point. And for me, I had that knee jerk reaction initially where I'm like, what kind of God would do this? But I'm like going, do I eat meat? And the answer is yes. I work out. I try to be physically fit. And I have learned that as I get a little bit older, that I really have to up my protein in order to have any sort of physical fitness. Otherwise, if I try legumes and other things, I really don't do as well. So then if I'm eating meat, what does it matter if it's in a religious context or not?
Mhm.
And then I was like, okay, fine. Maybe I'm being a little hypocritical here. I can eat meat, but I can't eat meat, if I bring it to the temple and, I have some sort of ritual slaughter. How does that denigrate the process in any way? So then I started examining it more and more. It's like, oh, well, you're actually sitting down with a priest, you're having a meal. Oh, you're going to be talking, you're going to be having a conversation. And then I was like, okay, let's put this in a modern context. Could you imagine you have your local state representative, and you go have a barbecue with them, a couple times a year? You sit down with them face to face.
At the
Um,
temple, no less, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Mhm.
I mean, that was just a huge turnaround in society. I mean, it's a great opportunity. Maybe you're having a problem with your kid. Maybe you don't know how to do something, or maybe you're wondering, the best way to change something, or you're having marital problems. That right there is a great opportunity to talk with that priest, to get some advice, some counsel, or just build a relationship. You know, I think that by denigrating it and just dismissing it because we have that visceral knee-jerk reaction of, oh, they're killing an animal, and there's an altar involved and there's priests. I think once we get past that, it's like, oh my goodness, this really serves society well, and it builds community. It builds that relationship between people who have an authority and administer some sort of justice in the land. They can hear the people's issues. You know, taxes are really, holding us down. Our crops didn't do as well, or da 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 da. And the priest can say, okay, well, there's a sin problem here. Maybe it's in this area. I didn't really realize that this was going on. Or maybe somebody was doing something that they didn't, when you apply the law, maybe they didn't realize that it was not wholly in line with the law. And the priest can say, well, why don't you try it this way? Let me offer you this counsel.
Yeah, very well said. And there's nothing primitive about animal sacrifice. Like, what is primitive about actively engaging in the sacrifice of this living being that you have to watch die for your sins or for your just sacrifice to God? I mean, you're not even always eating them. There's the elevation offering, which is completely burned, but it's the simple point. You're willing to kill an animal for food, but you're not willing to kill an animal for a spiritual purpose. And I conceptualized this early on that it's hypocritical to say, I'm willing to kill an animal for food or clothes, but I'm not willing to kill an animal for a spiritual purpose. So you're diminishing the importance of spirituality. And this idea that spirituality is entirely divorced from the physical realm is the primitive idea. That's the idiocy of saying that you can never act out a spiritual concept in real life. I mean, that is what life is. Life is spirit manifest in matter. So if you take that matter, this physical existence that we live, and sacrifice it up to God, it's extremely in line with the nature of existence. It's not at all a primitive mindset. I think it's actually very meaningful, and I find it to be quite dumb that people criticize it so much as if it's already been debunked, you know? And again, as you said, this is another place where the rabbinic and Christian mindset intersect, where the rabbinics say there's no sacrifices. We couldn't possibly rebuild the temple unless the Messiah dropped it out of the sky. And the Christians say, oh, I mean, there's no need for the temple because Jesus is the ultimate sacrifice. And both of these statements are a negation of the urgency to reinstate God's law as soon as we can. And the fact that there's this pacifist mindset with everything messianic in particular, because the Messiah is like the great pacifier for society, which again, the Torah never talks about gearing your worship towards a Messiah. It talks about gearing your worship towards God and having individual and national accountability to God and having functioning societies where laws are carried out and people are actually taking accountability for things that are going on, not just leaving it up to fate to just kind of fade away.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I've often said that you don't really believe something until you act on it. If you think that you can go up, say, on top of a really tall bridge and flap your arms, or maybe you have some sort of plastic chute, and you think you can jump and that is going to guide you, you're going to actually fly with that. You can believe that all you want, but until you take that leap and you prove that, your words are very, very cheap. And the same thing goes with what you proclaim to believe. I see a lot of people claiming a lot of things, but I don't see them acting on it. And I think it's just, again, playing that religion game. And this is where I find the Torah to provide something so much better, because the Torah is holistic. It's a lifestyle. It's a way of living. And it provides such meaning, such purpose, such joy, that how could I not do it? How could I do anything else? Because anything else would be so much less. And it would take away from the joy and the fulfillment and the knowing God. I mean, and until you walk that walk, everybody wants to criticize it before they try it. And I'm like, well, we'll try it. It actually is very, very rewarding. And but yeah, you do have to do it. And I think that in this very probably a hedonistic world, but where we're just so self-centered, and we have really made ourselves into our own gods, where rather than allowing the thus says Yahweh of the text define what we believe and define how we determine what is our beliefs, as you said earlier, it's like, we want to put ourselves in that place and we want to say what that is. So I think that just being out there in kind of a very nebulous where nothing is pinned down, we just lose so much rich meaning and a lifestyle that we could be enjoying.
Yeah, and that's what's so compelling about the Torah is it's actionable. It's not just a bunch of baseless claims about believe some arbitrary thing and then everything will be fine. No, it's actionable methods that need to be taken that are in perfect reflection of what a healthy civilization would look like. Men and women coming together, creating families, having communities, having justice, taking care of the poor, having a place of centralized worship, actually worshiping one God with one law. That's unity, that's humanity. I mean, that that is going to work even if it wasn't true. It would still work. In which case, doesn't that mean that it's true? Getting back to this disconnect between the metaphor and the literal reality, that people don't seem to be able to bridge that gap. They're like, well, maybe it's metaphorically true, but it's not literally true. It's like, but if the metaphor is so true that it reflects that reality in the material world, doesn't that mean that doesn't that imply that this is true? That this history is real, that this God is real? It's such a perfect fit. Like when it's a perfect fit like that, it's almost like, okay, the shoe fits, it's Cinderella. Like, okay, we don't be like, maybe it's someone else, right? Like the fit is too perfect to then go ahead and say, um, yeah, it's just another fairy tale. Because it's easy to do that. It's easy to chalk up the Torah to another one of these man-made religions with a bunch of unreasonable claims and subjective opinions. But when you look at how impactful it is and how truthful it is and how important it is to have this as a backbone in society, it makes you realize that you have to believe that it's true. And let me ask you this. Why do you think it matters to believe that it's literally true, that the events described in the Torah literally took place? Why can't you just believe it's metaphorically true?
Several reasons. Number one, the claim is that it's true. I mean, I am Yahweh, your God that brought you out of the land of Egypt. If you're going to dismiss that statement and say it's all metaphor, I mean, the whole entire premise, the whole entire revelation is on an actual history that occurred. And I actually had a friend years ago. We went round and round and round. If Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob never existed, would Scripture still be true? And my answer is no. Scripture would not be true. If they never existed, if Yahweh never met with Israel at Mount Sinai, if he never spoke the words of his covenant, then that the alternative and the corollary to that is that it was man-made. And why should we then follow Moses over an Egyptian god or over Aten or even later Muhammad? I mean, what makes or Jesus? What makes and by implication, anything Jesus would have said would also have been bunk because it would have been based on a man-made text. So it really becomes a very, very circular reasoning where there has to be historicity. And just a little plug here, if anybody has following Michael Shlomo Bar Ron's research, he has found inscriptions in the Sinai mentioning Moshe several times. He's also found some Psalms, and his work has been, believe it or not, actually very pleasantly received. And it's been covered by major news networks, New York Post and things like that. So if y'all want to go look that up, there's a lot of archaeological evidence to support the historicity of the claims that we have in the Bible.
Yeah, and look, even if it wasn't historically accurate, and you wanted to take the life lessons and the concepts of law that exist there, you would still benefit in your life. However, it says something about reality. Like, if reality is really just this endless continuum, and all of our encounters with God are just a human metaphor of God and a concept of God and a concept of life, a concept of law, it takes away from the reality of all this. It just means that we're forever doomed to be distant from God because God never actually speaks to us. Well, the definition of prophecy is just an alignment of spirit with the unity of the powers of existence, right? It doesn't have the same severity as God said to Moses. You said, Yehovah spoke to Moses saying, these are the words. Moses speaking face to face, mouth to mouth, direct communication. That breaks a hole right in the continuum of existence of this seemingly, in the Darwinian perspective, it's literally just billions and billions of years of nothingness, and like micro evolutionary advancements to get to some arbitrary conclusion. All of these worldviews are so empty because they really don't wake us up to the fact that God is present, God is real, God is here. He can, as you said, you can speak to him, you can call him by name, and he can come back. He can make those miracles that he made in Egypt. He can make them here in the United States. He can make them here in the state of Israel. Things that people think are just fairy tales and metaphors, which they would again still have value if they just were, but it's important to realize the reality of this. And I just want to read to you this verse I'm sure you're familiar with. After the Song of Moses in Deuteronomy, it says, Deuteronomy 32:47, Moses is speaking to the Israelites. He says, this is not an empty matter for you, rather it is your life, and with this word you will have lengthy days upon the ground that you cross the Jordan to inherit. He's saying, don't just interpret this as an empty matter, some sort of, vassal text that doesn't actually contain any real truth. No, this is your life. And I think that that's something that people are like, oh, it's okay. It's not your life. Maybe you can gather some important information, some historical nods to understandings of the ancients. No, no, no. This is your life. I think that that's a very powerful statement.
I agree. The basis, whether we look at modern Israel today, and even America, it doesn't really matter what nation you're in. The more in line you are with the Torah, the greater peace you're going to have. The more joy, the more happiness, the prosperity, everything. But then the more you decline from that, the more you're going to have conflict in your society because you're not going to have justice. And you brought up the point earlier about joy and unity. The Danes are usually used as the model for a happy society. When they do polls of different nations, they report the greatest statistic of being happy. But what do they have? They share the fact that they're all ethnically very similar. They share the fact that they all religiously have the same religious outlook, the same belief system. They all celebrate the same holidays. I mean, it's that unity of belief, the unity of culture, of family, that really give them the greatest joy and the greatest positive outlook in life. And it's that same thing for Israel. When you have that unity, when you base your beliefs on a system of life that works, you have amazing joy. For me, one of the things that I've learned in my studies is that when you look at, say, Deuteronomy 31, I think it's verse 17, it talks about a period of time where Yahweh would hide his face from us. We would go through this horrific time of judgment where, every man raises his hand against his brother. There's just war after war. I mean, that, of course, is long before nations turned their swords into plowshares or farm instruments. And, nation rises up against nation. So I think for the last 2,000 years, we haven't really seen God work on our behalf. We haven't really seen him active among us. We've kind of been at the mercy of whatever nation we've been into, whether, it's Babylon, Assyria, whether it's, Germany, France, or Gaul, or the Roman Empire, depending what stage of history, you're really at the mercy of that government. You go through periods of peace, periods of war, oppression. But there's a promise that, to what you said, that God will return to us. I mean, Isaiah talks about him, coming from Basra and returning to his people. And Deuteronomy talks about that. If you will from there, seek for me with all your heart and with all your soul, I will be found of you. And the promise to that is, I will return you to the land. I'll make you a people again. I'll give you peace. And then Ezekiel talks about this new covenant and how the final promise of this is that God has promised that he will never again hide his face from us. So it's a process, and that return doesn't just occur because God's like, okay, I'm just going to return. It occurs, as Deuteronomy 4 says, because we seek him, because we call upon his name. We're like, we're done with this. We want to do it God's way. And it all comes down to that humility and being willing to finally, after what, 3,000 years, 4,000 years, going, okay, we've done it our way. We've tried it. Maybe it doesn't work out so well.
Yeah, one of the things I love about that passage where God talks about hiding his face, he says, "And you will ask on that day, is it because there is no God that all of these evil things have happened to us?" And God says, "No, no, no. Of course there is a God, but I have concealed my face." Right? And that's the whole point. Is like, we perceive the evils that come upon us and God concealing his face as the non-existence of God, which is exactly what's been happening, right? The atheist movement is growing. People are saying there is no God. He doesn't exist. He couldn't exist, right? Yet what God is actually saying is, I've concealed my face because of your evil. So what is the response to this? It's not for you to continue to be evil. It's for you to humble yourself and return to God, and then you will start to see redemption. And the beauty about the unity of Israel, as opposed to say the Danish nations, is that the unity is in God. It's not just the things that, like, oh, we have the same race, we have the same skin color. I mean, the unity of Israel is above ethnicity, it's above race, it's above culture. It's the unity in God and the one God and his law. That is a unity that it could expand to all of humanity. And that's what I love about the vision and the prophets too, who speak of the joining of the nations to Israel and the streaming of the nations to Israel for a united worship of all nations. So that it's not just worship of one nation to God, but of all the nations. And that's just so much more appealing as an ultimate vision than just, my God, my people, this, okay, that's just very regressive tribalism. And I find that to be so interesting that God opens the door to that being a possibility, when, even though that it starts off Abraham, then specifically Isaac, not Ishmael, specifically Jacob, not Esau, right? Specifically the sons of Jacob, the sons of Israel. But suddenly God says, well, also the convert, also whoever's living amongst you, whoever's here today, as it says in Deuteronomy, whoever's here today and who's ever not here today. That's Deuteronomy 29.
29.
Yeah, 29. See, where is it? 14, 29, 14, right? For whoever
Yep,
is here today with us and whoever's not here. Well, that opens the door to all of the future generations as well. And we
it
can all
does.
pass through this covenant together.
Absolutely. And, this is the thing when in Exodus 19, when God brings the elders before him, before he speaks to Israel, and he puts before them the terms of his covenant, and he asks them, are you willing to obey this? And he right there promises them that they'll be a holy nation and a kingdom of priests. You know, I've heard people who just take this as a very, um, prideful, pious thing. Oh, we're a kingdom of priests. We're kind of like holier than thou. And it's like, do you know what priests do? Priests serve people. Just like we think of a pastor today or a teacher or, and I hate to use the thing, but the greatest among people is a servant, that concept. But that is what a priest is. A priest serves the people. He teaches the people. He corrects the people. And so if Israel is to be a nation of service, a nation of priests,
Who are
then
they?
they're going to minister to the nations, teaching them and bringing them and drawing them closer to God. What they're not going to do is isolate and say, oh, this is only for me. It's mine. You can't have it.
Mhm.
Get away from me. It's mine. Don't touch it. That's not what God has
Which
in
is what they have done. I mean, and it's in part and parcel of their law, which is, the Talmud, which has been exposed in recent years for saying despicable things about non-Jews and creating an entire religion, which is divorced from the Torah, about pushing away non-Jews from accessing the Torah at the threat of death, actually, for non-Jews who would keep the Sabbath or who study the Torah, and just the most horrific statements about non-Jews in general, when these people fail to understand that the Bible begins with the story of humanity. This is
right.
about humanity. And God choosing Israel is a realization for humanity, right? It says God's firstborn is Israel. Well, if the firstborn is Israel, then who are the rest of the children, right? So the firstborn is supposed to be a role model, supposed to be a trailblazer for the other children, but there are many other children. And that's the beauty of that.
Exactly. Well, and I think another really important point is, what is the reason that three different times Jehovah gives us for keeping the Sabbath? Why are we supposed to keep that day holy? And it's because it is a memorial to creation. So if it's a memorial to creation, did God only create Israel? Did God only create the Jews? Or did he create all of humanity? So if it's a memorial to creation, then doesn't that imply strongly, I think, that the Sabbath should be observed by all humanity?
Yeah. Exactly. Well, I mean, it says that it's a sign between God and Israel. And so the rabbis interpreted that to mean, well, if it's a sign between God and Israel, then by definition, no one else can keep it at the threat of death, which is, of course, one of these absurd Talmudic interpretations that have no reflection or basis in the text at all. And so there's been zero accountability for the rabbis of the Talmud for 2,000 years. And, I pray that people wake up to the damage that's been done by the Talmud and all of these writings that have misrepresented the Torah and actually turned the Jewish people into more of a hateful group of people than a beloved nation that's supposed to be a blessing to the world, which is what God's vision is for us. And to your point about the priests serving the people, there's the story of Korah, who's the rebellious Levite in the desert, who tries to usurp the power from Moses and Aaron and says, we're all holy, we should be the leaders. And Moses says to him, is it not enough for you? This is Numbers 16:9. Is it not enough for you that the God of Israel separated you from amongst the community of Israel to bring you near to him to serve the service of the tabernacle, the sanctuary of Yahweh, and to stand before the people, the congregation, to minister to them, right? And so that's the role of a priest, to minister God's sanctuary and to minister the people. And the fact that a priest who has a role to minister, by definition, as you said, you have someone to serve, but then they're just self-serving. So that's undermines their whole purpose.
And this, I think, is such a blessing that Yahweh has for us today, because now it is possible. You have Safra online, and now you can actually research the Talmud. And I think because we have that access, we need to use it wisely. This is a great opportunity for dialogue, for discussion. And whether you're on the Jewish side, whether you're on the Christian side, there's the reason that in America and in the West, people say Judeo Christianity is because of the fact that it is only Jews and Christians who are brothers. They split from the same root. It is because it is only Jews and Christians that base their beliefs on that original Torah and Tanakh document, the Old Testament. And that is where we can find the unity. That's where we can find the healing. Because if Jews will interact and have discussions with Christians based on the text, I think a lot of Jews are going to find when they're challenged on the teachings of the Talmud that they denigrate, that they have added to and taken away from Yahweh's word. Same thing, I think, for Jews when they interact with Christians and they have those hard discussions with Christians. I think Christians can gain a lot of respect for the Jewish belief system, but at the same time hold them accountable again for that contradiction of adding to and taking away. So I think that dialogue between Jews and Christians, who I consider brothers, I think that can be extremely healing and offer a new beginning. But again, it is that text, it is that thus says Yahweh, the word that is ultimately doing that healing and bringing two brothers divided back together. It's Ezekiel's vision of the rods, the staff of Judah and Ephraim becoming one in Yahweh's hand. And that doesn't just happen magically. That happens through a lot of study, through a lot of seeking, a lot of prayer, and a lot of dialogue. And I think that dialogue of discussing the issues without having being emotional, getting upset, but an honest, okay, you think this, I think that. Let's talk about why. Maybe we put our ideas down, we walk away and we think about it, and maybe we come back and talk about it later on after we've studied that out a little bit.
Yeah.
And let's see where that conversation can go.
But if we can all agree upon the Torah being the beginning of all of this, which it just
Yeah.
is, factually speaking, then we're all accountable to that original text, which says, "Do not add or subtract, do not worship other gods, do not," so like we can all agree to that, and then we can find the things that we disagree upon. But if we don't agree on that foundational text, then we will have no common ground. And ironically, when the Christians speak about Jesus, redeeming people from the law, they're usually referring to the Pharisees' laws, to the
Yes.
observance of rabbinic law and the slavery that they placed on the people, independent of Torah law, because Jesus obviously says not one dot or tittle shall be removed from the law until it's fulfilled, which means it must be fulfilled, and fulfilling the law is a constant thing. In addition to the fact that people say, "How do I be righteous?" And he says, "Follow the commandments." And he says, "Depart from me, you lawless ones." Right? So the idea that Christianity is here to remove the law, or that Jesus himself is here to remove the law, would be a contradiction to the teachings of Jesus himself. Now, what he was doing, though, was going against the Pharisees and saying, "Look at these thieves, look at these frauds, look at the terrible restrictions that they're placing on the people that remove you from the spirit of God and the spirit of the law." And, for that he was killed, let's be honest.
Right. Well, and all of those points that you just made, I made in my recently released book, Does Jesus Exist? And I went through it and I showed, well, Jesus says, go your way and sin no more. And I asked the question, does this mean that Jesus lied? Did he tell someone to go your way? Was he just giving platitudes where making them feel better? Or did he really mean that this person was capable of going his way and not sinning anymore? So either Jesus lied by just doing peaceful, feel good platitudes, or Jesus really meant it and he told the truth.
And I think the confusion may come with the later gospels, like Paul's viewpoint that's more anti-law than Jesus himself, where Paul says, the law can't be fulfilled and things like that, which is similar to what the rabbis say, you cannot fulfill the law without us, right?
Right.
So it's like this idea that the Torah itself is inaccessible and unfulfillable unless you have some sort of other doctrine, some sort of other religion, other book, something else to follow other than the Torah, when that in and of itself flies in the face of the original revelation, which is all about you must you must follow the commandments. You have to do this. And if you make a mistake, the response is return to God and start to improve yourself, as God tells Cain. God doesn't tell Cain, go. have faith in Jesus, he says, improve yourself, right? Like that's what actually needs to be happening, actual self-improvement of each and every individual that could result on a nationwide scale. But otherwise, we're just looking at people wrapped up in their own meaningless beliefs and in a semantic battle, as like, what do these terms really mean when that's not at all productive?
Right. Well, and again, I think that semantic battles all too often is the battle between, am I going to follow my self-created beliefs, or am I going to follow the beliefs that are God down, divine revelation that comes outside of me? And that's a really hard battle for a lot of people to overcome, because they've inherited so many different voices that denigrate the text, and then even the pastors, the religious leader, and it's not acceptable in society. And as we've been talking about, whether you're on the Jewish side or you're on the Christian side, both sides want to denigrate that text because it is a threat to their power structure. If you and I can look to the Torah, we can read it. Maybe we have to study some ancient Near Eastern documents. Maybe we have to read a few books to get some context, to whatever. It's not something that's very difficult, like for instance, one of the things that I've recently learned that I was pretty blown away with, that Deuteronomy 30, when it talks about it's not that you don't have to go over the sea to get it, Moses was actually challenging some of the ideas associated with Gilgamesh and that myth that was very popular, kind of the Jesus myth of its day in some ways. And Moses is challenging that idea. Well, just doing that historical research, it's like I gained a new perspective. So we can all do that. We can all follow the rabbit trails and increase our learning and our understanding with a contextual understanding. But guess what? You and I are capable of doing that. I mean, we can do it. It's not too hard for us. It can be very, very fun. But for us to pray, for us to find truth, we don't have to go through a man to do that.
Mm.
There's no one between me and God. I mean, it's a very, very connected relationship where if I need something, I seek him. I tell him my heart. I tell him, I praise him. I thank him. But it's a very direct relationship. But it is that direct relationship that challenges the current power structures. And that's why they are so adamant that no, 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 you're going to get it all wrong. And they put a lot of fear in you so that you back away and you revert to, I mean, just like doctors,
Yeah, I was
yeah.
going to say that. In the same way that the medical system profits from people being sick, the political and religious systems profit from people being divided and confused,
And
right?
sinful.
And sinful and poor, right? And all of these things because, a broken home is much easier to control than home that's intact. If you have an intact home with a strong father and a strong mother and children and a family unit, what do you need the government for? Right. But if you have, a father who leaves his family and a mother who's, whoring around and kids are like scattered and being raised by the government institutions, well, I mean, that's a perfect storm, like a bunch of parentless children and childless parents. It's a it's a perfect storm for the government to enter as the saviors and be like, well, come listen to us, or the religious institutions, whatever it is. So, I mean, that's the scary stuff is when you look at how the institutions of today and seems to be of history are just entirely corrupt top down. It just means that we all have to create better alternatives and reinforce our own personal lives and our own personal relationships with God.
Absolutely. And that awareness, Karl Marx had that awareness, and that's why he advocated that the very first structure that needed to be abolished under communism was the individual family unit. So it's not by accident that religion seeks to divide the family unit, medical care seeks to divide the family unit. I can't tell you how many cases of manufactured child abuse have been filed just for the money that they get for taking the child out of the home. I'm actually part of a group that fights that. And then also whether you look at government and the money that the government makes off of it or the medical society makes off of it. It's just so many different ways. And Karl Marx was really the first one to put it in writing and say, the goal of communism is the dissolution of the individual family unit. And I think since then, people have just kind of seen, oh, yeah, this is a great way to gain power and to make money off of it.
Mm.
And that awareness, awareness is the first step to prevention, first step to overcoming. And once you take that first step, then hopefully all those other steps follow until you get to that point of healing and healthy relationships.
Yeah. But, unfortunately, we see so many trends away from that. There was situations cropping up around the country in recent years where child protective services were taking kids away from their parents because parents refused to acknowledge their 5-year-old kid as transgender. And like we're looking at just the complete destruction and breakdown of humanity and all of this. And again, weak, confused, parentless children are the easiest to control, and they will grow up to be perfect stewards of the state. I mean, a woman told me about a situation where her daughter had her child taken away from her because she had had the child when she was under 18, and the child was taken away from her and it died in foster care like a few weeks later. It's like, and
Yeah,
the government to decide, and her daughter wasn't even doing drugs or being irresponsible. Like her daughter was living with the father of the child, with her boyfriend or husband, and they were renting an apartment, they were working, they were doing everything right, but because they weren't the government age of whatever, so now you get the child taken away from you, and now the child dies.
right.
And this is just
Well, yeah, and to that, it's very well known that if you are of a very poor economic status, that the government will come after you because you can't afford legal recourse. Now, one of the things that Mississippi did here about 3 years ago, it was introduced by Senator Angela Burks Hill, is they enacted a law called I think it was the Family First Law, where before the state could remove the child for abuse, they first had to, by law, place it with family members so that grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, all came first before the government could ever get their hands on that child. And that has helped to curb some of that just, outrageous overstepping of the bounds.
well, look, we got to do whatever we can. Obviously, we're working with a pretty corrupt system, a pretty unideal world, but we have to do the best we can. And I think that strong families are the future. That is the Torah's model as well. The redemption story in Deuteronomy 30, verse 2, does not mention a Messiah, does not mention anything other than you and your children should return to God. And that is the path to redemption, the individual and the family unit. And that's liberating. That's the opposite of communism, the opposite of totalitarianism. And to speak on the point of freedom, as you said, even something like free speech. I think the Torah's only limitations on speech are you cannot curse God and you cannot curse your parents. I mean, I don't think there's any other limitation on speech.
Curse your king. It doesn't mean you can't criticize your king, but you can't curse him.
Well,
It says the ruler of your people.
yeah, do not curse a prince amongst your people, you know, and stuff like that. So there's
It's limited.
there's also no penalty for that though, as opposed to there's a death penalty for cursing God or your parents, but there's no penalty for cursing your princes. And again, a prince is not just a self-appointed prince; it's someone who's actually worthy of that. For example, Abraham was told by the Hittites, "You're a prince of God amongst us," right? So if you curse Abraham, you got a problem. But if you curse, I don't know, some self-appointed piece of shit, like that's everyone could call themselves a prince. But that's why we need a just court. We need a just priesthood. We need a just society where people are actually living correctly. As it says, justice you shall pursue, righteousness, judges and law enforcement who are there to enforce the laws of the Torah, because that's really the only justice that exists, and it is a radical thing, and ultimately it is religious fundamentalism. And I recall, wanting to move away from that after witnessing it in the wrong contexts. But that's the thing, is there's got to be a right way in which to experience God, in which to experience religion, in which to experience law. And so there's the corrupt ways, and I think all of the corruption have made people cynical to the point where they just doubt everything and they're skeptical of everything they hear. And I understand that, but at the same time, I urge people to consider that maybe, just maybe, within all of the lies and all of the false gods, there's just a kernel of truth, and there is just one God who is true, and that's Jehovah and His Torah.
Absolutely. I think our real problem with religious fundamentalism is really the fact that they added and they took away so much. And I think it takes it in the wrong way because, you have, at least in Christianity, fundamentalism is you can't dance, you have to have long hair, you can't wear jewelry, can't wear makeup, you have to, if you're go the Mennonite way, wear long skirts. So it's the additions that are not in the text.
Right.
That is the
The
fundamentalism.
celibacy for priests and nuns, or again, the rabbinic laws, which are just over the top with the.
Yeah, that takes fundamentalism and takes it, times 1,000.
Mhm.
You can only walk certain amount of steps on the Sabbath. Don't do anything creative on the Sabbath. Don't have any fun.
Well, I mean, even
Uh,
the rabbis go so far as to say you cannot walk 4 feet with your head uncovered or with your back straight. So essentially, according to the rabbis of the Talmud, you have to walk with your back hunched over and some sort of kippah or head covering on your head. So they have laws on how to tie your shoes, on I kid you not, how to wipe your ass, and like it goes that deep. So of course, there's no freedom there, but in the Torah, you're given so much freedom. Yet God is also showing you those are the red lines you don't want to cross, because if you cross those red lines, you're only looking at destruction for yourself, for your family, for the world. So as long as you stay within the confines of the garden, I guess metaphorically, then you can live in paradise. But the minute that you go against God's commandments, you're only looking at a decline from there.
yeah, I completely agree.
All right.
Completely agree.
Well, do you
I,
have?
and I
Yeah.
think that's why David said that the law was perfect. Tanim.
Yeah.
In
Tamim. Yeah.
Psalms 19 verse 7.
Hmm.
Because it's not too onerous, but it's the perfect balance between mercy and justice, where it's not too rigorous, but yet it doesn't ignore the important issues.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's a balance when we our encounter with God, for all of people's attempt to say, God is love or God is just rage. Like, no, God is both. God is
Mhm.
everything in one, and that's the brilliance of what we're dealing with. As you said, the Egyptians have one God for everything, one different God for everything. We have one God for everything, as opposed to they have a different God for everything. So, that's a different worldview. One worldview sees everything as fundamentally united, the other worldview sees everything as fundamentally separated. And when everything's separated, then you can get away with corruption in one area because it's not going to bleed over into the other area. But when you understand this butterfly effect idea that everything is so connected in this really, really real way, that you can't just say, oh, live and let live, let everyone do whatever they want. No, the Torah makes it clear that it matters what other people are doing, even in their private homes. It matters because everything matters. As opposed to, say, the nihilistic view where nothing matters. The Torah says, no, everything matters. So it's the exact opposite.
Yeah, and that's like, again, where I think that holistic approach, where the Torah is heart, mind, soul, and it's all manifested in action. And that's why action, and some of the criticism has been, the Torah, the caustic laws of the Torah, it's all these do's and don'ts, but it isn't. It's the fact that reveals what's in your heart. It's not that the heart is excluded, but for a legal document can't judge your heart. If you're going to court, if you've sinned and there's some penalty, a court can't intervene in that because a court can't judge your heart, but a court can judge your physical actions. But throughout the Torah, God says, Jehovah says, love me with your whole heart, your whole mind, your whole soul, your whole being. And that's a very holistic approach to a relationship with God. I mean, you can't get more holistic than that.
Yeah, and it's fundamentally love. And there's love and there's fear and there's judgment and there's mercy. And we need all of those aspects in order to have a holistic living because otherwise everything is broken apart into pieces. Well, I just
Absolutely.
wanted to ask you if you have any closing statements.
No, I think that's it. I mean, we covered a lot of ideas, and I think it was a great conversation. I enjoyed it.
Awesome. Well, me as well. And, I urge everyone to check out your channel and the things you're doing. And, we're both coming from different backgrounds, but come to the same conclusion. The Torah, the five books of Moses, is the foundation of the Bible and everything we really know to be true about reality and God. And people should read it without commentary. Just read the words. The translations out there, they're not perfect, but they do the job. They teach you what it says. And,
Well,
we all need to get back to that.
we do, and I will say a fantastic resource that people may not know. If you will, in your Google browser, whatever browser you use, type in whatever verse you want to look up. So I'm going to just say Exodus 20, verse 1, and then follow it up with these words: Hebrew text analysis or Hebrew text morphology. When you type those words in, it's going to parse that verse for you, where you're going to see the Hebrew, you're going to see the English transliteration, you're also going to see the parsing of the words. So you're going to see whether it's a masculine singular, you're going to see whether it's a Hiphil verb, whether it's a qual verb, and whether it's masculine or single. It's going to break all that down for you. It even has the strongness numbers, and you can use it links to the Englishman's Concordance, so you can get an idea of everywhere that where that word is used, so you have context. And that, I think, if you're just starting out, is the best way to get started with coming back to a relationship with the text and getting to know it based on what it says as close to the Hebrew as possible.
Yeah, no, there are plenty of resources. I myself am actually working on a translation of the Torah. I'm almost done. I'm in chapter 25 of Deuteronomy. So I'm getting,
Fantastic.
yeah, I'll let you all know when it's published, God willing, sooner than later. But yeah, I mean that's my goal is just to make it accessible to people and just read it like a book, It's not that long. People read 500-page novels. It's pretty entertaining. I mean, the stories are wild. The laws will make you think whether you agree or not, you just kind of get to the point where you start to humble yourself to this resource because it's clearly so above anything else out there. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
I agree.
All right. Well, pleasure seeing you again. Sure,
You
we'll
too.
do this sometime in the future. And I hope
Yes.
the audience benefits and God willing, we all get a step closer to the truth of God.
Amen.
All right. Have a great day.
You too.
Bye bye.
Bye.